We've looked at two rebellions so far, the Epiphany Plot and the Glendower Revolt. The one we're moving on to today is the Percy Rebellion, which actually takes place during the Glendower Revolt, particularly in 1403. It is one of the key years of this rebellion. So this video is going to cover the context behind the rebellion, what, if anything, sparked the actual rebellion to take place, who was involved, any key battles, significant winners and losers, and the ramifications following the plot itself. So the context behind the rebellion, there were some prominent figures that helped Henry Bolingbroke depose Richard II to become King Henry IV. Among those were Henry Percy, 1st Earl of Northumberland, and his son Sir Henry Percy, nicknamed Hotspur by his Scottish enemies for the way in which he patrolled their borders. There's two strings of thought as to what actually sparked the rebellion. Henry IV had rewarded the Percys greatly with lands and offices in northern England and Wales, and he made them the largest landowners in Northumberland. But some say their ambitions were deeper than he could ever accommodate, and they sought to control the throne itself. One school of thought says that they parted ways over a simple falling out in dispute of a ransom over a Scottish rebel. Hotspur had captured the Earl of Douglas at a certain battle, and Henry demanded the prisoner and claimed the ransom for himself, and that's what led to the break, and the Percys withdrew their support for Henry and backed Edmund Mortimer. Another school of thought is that Henry had promised land and money to a number of nobles in return for their support. That includes the Percys. When the early battles against Glendower ended, lands in and around Cumberland that had been promised to the Percy family were given to a rival, and promised money never materialised, and that's what led to the Percys rebelling. So the key people to know about in terms of this rebellion: Edmund Mortimer, Henry Percy, 1st Earl of Northumberland, his son Sir Henry Percy, also known as Hotspur, and of course King Henry IV and his son Prince Hal. We will cover them in more detail as we go through the course, but those were the key players of this particular rebellion. So the key battle in the rebellion was known as the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403. Henry Hotspur had a hastily mustered force, quite a large force, and he headed towards Shrewsbury to join forces with the other rebels that had gathered there. That town, however, was garrisoned by the king's eldest son, Prince Hal. However, the force he had at his command was unlikely to be able to withstand an attack of the size that was heading their way. On hearing this news, Henry IV headed northwest to try and intercept Hotspur before he could join forces with the rebels under Glendower's command. This became known as the Race for Shrewsbury, which was in fact won by Henry IV. He reached the town before Hotspur did, on or around the 20th of September 1403. This meant that Henry Percy became isolated on the north side of the town. Between him stood the River Severn and the King's army, which meant his reinforcements from Wales were unable to get there. He withdrew from the town and spent the night about 3 miles northwest of Shrewsbury at the village of Berwick. And the following morning, with no sign of Glendower, but with the King's forces advancing towards him, he hurriedly left Berwick and headed away from the river. With Hotspur retreating and the King's Guard advancing on him, it did ultimately mean that a battle was inevitable, and that battle did come to fruition. To cut a long story short, the battle went the way of Henry on the whole. There was one incident in which Prince Hal was left fighting for his life in a way. He was hit in the face with an arrow, but luckily, due to the immense skills of physician John Bradmore, he made a recovery, although he was left with a permanent scar. The Percys did suffer significant losses. Not only did they lose the battle itself, but Sir Henry Percy, the son of the Earl of Northumberland, was killed during the battle. It wasn't all plain sailing for Henry IV. He suffered huge losses, more so in fact than those of the rebel forces. There were times where he nearly lost his life. Had the battle been won, he would have lost his throne. So there were some times where it was looking less than certain. And obviously the wound to Prince Hal would have been of significant concern to him in the early days. In political terms, the revolt was extremely important. Henry could have been extremely aggressive towards those involved, but in fact he was lenient to the Earl of Northumberland, who was of course grieving for the loss of his son who was killed in the Battle of Shrewsbury. But ultimately Henry knew that the power, the influence that the Percy family had no longer existed. So what were the ramifications of the rebellion? Well, it showed that Edmund Mortimer still had considerable support, even from those who were on Henry's side, particularly in the early years of his reign. This would have been a worry to Henry, not knowing who he could trust, not knowing who he could turn to. So it did have ramifications in that sense. However, in terms of positive news for Henry, after this rebellion, the Percy family were no longer a threat. Henry had again secured the throne after another attack. He'd survived the Epiphany plot, the Glendower rebellion, he was holding off, and this just showed that he did have the support that was necessary for him to stay on the throne. So if we focus on the Battle of Shrewsbury, that was a significant military event. It was the first occasion where massed troops armed with a longbow had been pitted against each other on home soil, on English soil, and in tactical formations that would be so effective in the coming decades against the French, notably the Battle of Agincourt that you'll study in 1415. So all in all, the rebellion had sprung out of a dispute between Henry and his former allies. They turned on him and joined the forces with Glendower to support the claim that Mortimer had to the throne. This in turn meant that once again Henry had to defend himself. He was forced to rely on the strategic importance of his son, who was proving himself to be an extremely effective military leader, something that will stay with him through life, and particularly when he becomes king himself. It was a short rebellion, longer than the Epiphany plot, very different to the Epiphany plot. Obviously we've looked at the Glendower revolt that went on for years and years. This plot was over quite quickly in terms of that scale, but it did have lasting implications, lasting ramifications, both positive and negative. It showed Henry that there were still threats against him. Just to sum up what's been said in the video, the Percy family quickly turned on him. Who else could do that? However, he was quick to fight them off. He won. He secured his throne again, secured his throne for the future. So, in terms of was it a successful rebellion? Probably not. But it did show that there was still support for those against Henry. And to conclude, what it did do, particularly the Battle of Shrewsbury, was pave the way for a different type of warfare, a more effective type of warfare, that when you come to study the Battle of Agincourt next year, you will see used extremely successfully by Henry V against the French troops at Agincourt, and that arguably stems back to the battle that took place at Shrewsbury in 1403. So to sum up, who was involved, why it started, the background behind the rebellion. Was it as severe as some of the others that have come before it? Well, that's up to you to decide. There were extreme key players in it, losses for both sides in terms of men from Henry and key nobles from the Percy rebellion, but it did pave the way for new warfare in the future, which I think is a key thing to take away from this video.